How do you feel about the sentence?
Was the sentence
Jonathan,
fair?
how do you feel about the sentence?
Was the sentence fair?
Was it fair? Will you
Was
be
it
back,
fair?
Jonathan?
So, a few quick observations on the Jonathan Majors sentencing day, which I was in New York for, I was in the courtroom for, and I was more than happy to meet some of my YouTube friends. Dre Mack and Danny Atherton were also there. It was fantastic. But at any rate, so was the media. I remain very surprised at how much media was there. I don't know why I was naive enough to think that it wasn't going to be that much media, but there was a ton of media. And I will say this, it was a very interesting thing. One thing I do want to speak on is sort of a very interesting communications moment that happened inside the courtroom with regard to Grace Jabbari showing up, what I call sort of the look at the squirrel strategy. Obviously, as the day started and really as people started to contemplate the sentencing, everyone understood that Majors was very unlikely to get any prison time. Actually, when you look at the headlines, they really play in his favor. They play in his favor because so many of the headlines are he avoids jail time. No jail time was granted. Now, I don't know why anybody would have expected for a first time offender in a case where there is extremely thin evidence that there was an actual assault. And the reason I say extremely thin evidence, you have to remember that the only thing we really have that is sort of a slam dunk, and of course the prosecution had to use this because this was really the only thing that they had that was proving contact between the two people, was the moment when Jonathan Majors places Miss Jabari in the back of an SUV. Everything else, you have to sort of guess as to what happened because it's not on camera. So you can't really know for a fact that he caused any of the other injuries that were brought up at trial, namely the injury to her finger and this cut in the back of her ear. You don't really know how that happened. You know what she's saying, you know what she's testifying to, but there is no corroborating testimony. There's no friend that says, "Oh, I saw her, I saw him hit her in the back of the ear, or I saw her do something with her finger." The only thing you have is one person saying something, and that person, of course, has an extremely vested interest in saying that he caused those injuries. But we really don't know. These are alleged, just as it is alleged that Mr. Majors is claiming, and of course, that was the reason why Grace Jabari was arrested. The photos of his scratches to his face and his arm are what he's alleging. Now, of course, in my world, what I tend to do is believe absolutely nobody because people, of course, have a vested interest to say certain things. But what we do know for a fact is the video of the two of them running down the street would indicate that he was trying to get away from her in a big way. You don't run block after block after block because you want to be near somebody. We also, of course, had the testimony, which corroborates Mr. Majors' side of the story, of the only other person witnessing their behavior in a very closed, compact area, which would be the SUV. And that would, of course, be the driver's testimony. The driver's testimony, of course, swung very heavily in the direction of Mr. Majors, which, of course, was why the prosecution sort of panicked when he was testifying. And then we got into this whole back and forth about, whether or not the language issue was going to be a problem and could he understand English and all of that. Because, of course, everything that he was saying was backing up exactly what Mr. Majors was saying happened, which is that Ms. Jabari was hitting him. And then further, his photos of his injuries tended to indicate that that side of the story was, in fact, accurate. So Mr. Majors is the one with the corroborating witness, not Ms. Jabari. Then, of course, you have the fact that Ms. Jabari is chasing him. He's trying to get away from her. And in fact, the placing her in the back of the SUV was further evidence of him trying to get away from her. Then he, of course, books himself into a hotel, 70 blocks away from Miss Jabari. I mean, all of this to me is indicative of I'm trying to stay away from you. Then, of course, we had the further evidence that Ms. Jabari, tried to contact Mr. Majors over 30 times via her phone. And we don't have any of that coming from the other direction. We don't have Mr. Majors trying to do the same thing. So, with all of that said, you could tell that the prosecution had to do something to offset all of that information, including the fact, of course, that Mr. Majors got no jail time, which for a first time offender, of course, he got no jail time. One would, of course, argue that there should have been no trial at all. This should have been pled out a year ago. Of course, we're here because this gives the prosecution and the folks connected to the prosecution an opportunity to promote certain issues around this case with regard to domestic violence, which is frankly why I think this entire thing happened. I think that this was used as a vehicle to talk about certain issues. Now, one would think in the city of New York with 8 million people that there would be a much better case than this one. But of course, considering the fact that Jonathan Majors is in fact a very well-known actor, I think that is the reason why we find this case getting so much attention in court, full-blown over 2-week trial and all of that, which no one can convince me that any of this would have ever happened if Mr. Majors was named John Smith. I mean, it just never would have occurred. But at any rate, so what does the prosecution do to offset all of that information? Glaring information that goes into the direction of Ms. Majors. They bring Ms. Jabbari into court to make a victim impact statement. Because, of course, what they're trying to do is bury the news of the day. And the news of that day is the sentencing, the sentence, and what the sentence is. And once people hear probation, they know, wait a minute, this isn't as big of a deal as I was led to believe in all the other headlines I saw about domestic violence and all of, and he got probation. So it doesn't, when you pump it up to be a big thing and this is a big case and oh my goodness, he's such a terrible person, and then he gets probation, those things don't match up. You will notice that the prosecution didn't even ask for jail time. So it further backs up that this was not that big of a deal. I mean, even to them, they didn't even ask for jail time. With all of their verbiage in court, all of their hype in court, they didn't ask for jail time. So the cherry on top of that Sunday was that, okay, now he's not getting any, and we're not even asking for, we the prosecution, Kelly Galloway, isn't even asking for jail time. So that further made it very difficult for them from a communication standpoint to make this argument that they've all been making this entire time, that this is such a big case and so important and all this. That all falls apart when everybody hears the sentencing. So, of course, what do? They bring Ms. Jabbari into court to talk about this as if it's a murder case, right? Because I'm doing a victim impact statement. This is the biggest thing in the world. And what I got from it watching her in court was two things. One, she has not let go of this situation and of this person who she was dating. That's the first thing. Anybody who wants to move on with their lives, get on with what they're doing, get back to their career, get back to their work. The fact that she, I believe, is based in England makes it even more interesting that she would come all the way over here to focus on this. And no part of anything that was set up there would indicate that she's moved on. Remember that the last thing between these two people, the last known communication, is goodbye, Grace, did you leave the keys? Which is him in complete control of that moment of what happens next. In other words, goodbye. So he controlled that, absolutely controlled that. And quite frankly, in watching her in court on April 8, 2024, I don't think she's gotten over it in any way, shape, or form. The second thing is, once again, and it sort of jives with what was written in the civil complaint, there are some clear things that Team Jabbari is concerned about. And clearly they're concerned about the sleeping pill bottle being open came up in the statement. I thought that was really interesting. I think they're concerned about looking like, oh my goodness, this guy is, getting off easy. So we're going to bring things up and sort of backfill certain issues that are extremely difficult to explain. Extremely difficult to explain. I mean, it's difficult to explain how you're traumatized, but you're out drinking all night at Lucy's and you've got a bottle of pills on the floor and you're disrobed and you lock him out of his own place and you're texting a friend shortly before everyone shows up at his penthouse. Mr. Major shows up at his penthouse. That all is really hard to explain. It's going to be very hard to explain in a civil setting. So I, I think that what they were doing with this victim impact statement, was they're trying to get into the public domain certain arguments, which are pretty clear. Arguments really, I think, are going to be extremely difficult to make when you look at this case more broadly, which they will all, both sides will be allowed to do in a civil court setting. One of the big takeaways of the Majors case, and I wish I could go count it. I probably can't go count it if I get all the records together, is how many times Mr. Majors' attorneys were denied an opportunity to defend him in court. You know, objection sustained, objection sustained, objection sustained, over and over again. A police detective from New York City New York City Police Department couldn't even really testify completely because he couldn't talk, because everything was objected to and sustained by this judge. So that was interesting. I have much more. There's a lot to say here, but I just want to lay that down, and I'll see you soon.